evening. Welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the programme this evening, 6 major deals between India and the United States, either signed or about to be signed in what is being seen as a landmark visit. Certainly the most significant since India and the United States signed their civil nuclear deal. On this show, in just the next few minutes, we'll be joined by Ambassador John Bolton, who served as National Security Advisor of the United States from 2018 to 2019. We'll also be joined by some of India's finest diplomats who've served in the United States. But first up, here's a look at why today has been a truly landmark day in relations between India and the United States. We have done an $825 million semiconductor investment deal. There's a jet engine deal for jet engines to be made in India. An Indian astronaut will be on the space station. New consulates are being set up in each other's countries. Bengaluru and Ahmedabad for the United States and Seattle for India. H-1B visas will now be renewed in the United States. That is absolutely critical. And a deal worth maybe even up to $3.1 billion for MQ-9B drones will in fact be signed or be announced very soon. Now, there was a lot of pomp and pageantry at the White House. Remember, this is a state dinner. Let's just roll out some of those videos, some of those images of what we saw at the White House. President Biden and Prime Minister Modi went inside a little while back. They issued a statement, a remark each we're going to be playing that out. But very significantly, both sides, both leaders have decided that they're going to be looking at the entire gamut of the relationship between India and the United States. Before we go across to Ambassador Bolton, let's first listen in to what President Biden and Prime Minister Modi have had to say.
Prime Minister Modi, welcome back to the White House. The enduring ties and shared values between our people and the shared responsibility as global leaders to tackle the great issues of our time together. With your partnership, we've invigorated and elevated the Quad between the United States, India, Australia, and Japan to advance our vision of a free, open, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Decades from now, people will look back and say the Quad bent the arc of history toward global good, as the Prime Minister describes it. We're proud Americans and Indians' heritage serve our country every day, including our Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. Stories that define the relationship and the limitless possibilities between the United States and India. Two great nations, two great friends, two great powers that can define the course of the 21st century.
तो मैं राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन के मित्रतापूर्ण स्वागत और दीर्घ दृष्टिपूर्ण संबोधन के लिए उनका हृदय से बहुत बहुत आभार व्यक्त करता हूं. Thank you, President Biden, for your friendship. करीब 3 दशक पहले एक साधारण नागरिक के रूप में मैं अमेरिका यात्रा पर आया था और उस समय मैंने व्हाइट हाउस को बाहर से देखा था. प्रधानमंत्री बनने के बाद तो मैं स्वयं तो कई बार यहां पर आया हूं, लेकिन इतनी बड़ी संख्या में इंडियन अमेरिकन समुदाय के लिए व्हाइट हाउस के द्वार आज पहली बार खोले गए हैं. आप सब हमारे संबंधों की असली ताकत है. फ्रेंड्स, भारत और अमेरिका दोनों के समाज और व्यवस्थाएं लोकतांत्रिक मूल्यों पर आधारित है. दोनों देशों के संविधान, उसके पहले 3 शब्द और जैसा राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन ने अभी जिसका उल्लेख किया, वी द पीपल, हम दोनों देश अपनी विविधता पर गर्व करते हैं। आज दोपहर को मुझे यूएस कांग्रेस को एक बार फिर से संबोधित करने का अवसर मिलेगा। इस सम्मान के लिए मैं आपका हृदय से आभारी हूं।
Well, joining us now, a very special guest, Ambassador John Bolton. Sir, thanks very much for being with us. The civil nuclear deal a couple of years back, in fact several years back, was seen to be a landmark deal between the United States and India. Do you believe that this is the most substantive meeting or state visit that's taken place since then?
Well, certainly in terms of the economic consequences, as you've been enumerating, this is a number of very significant steps forward. But of course, they also deal importantly on security questions, and I think have an additional importance for that reason. There's a lot to talk about here, many complicated issues, but I think these steps indicate the direction that we need to go in the future to deal with the challenges that both countries face. And you have to name it to understand it, the challenge of China. There are many other issues to cover as well, but that is a significant threat to peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's what Congress wants to hear, the Prime Minister's views on that in particular.
So, Ambassador, you would say that it is that common security concern, which is obviously China, which is actually driving a lot of what we are seeing, specifically the jet engine deal. America has not transfer this sort of technology to any other country in the world. Is it driven by the fact that America needs India to be secure?
Well, I think that's right. I think it's really it's a joinder of the economic and the security, and I think that's the sort of thing we'd love to see because it draws the two countries closer together. We have common political structures. If we have more economic relations, common security interests, as the United States does with many countries around the world, I think that helps create stability in the region. There's no doubt about it.
Ambassador, you've seen the relationship from a strategic standpoint grow between India and the United States. In terms of China, how has that relationship really been beneficial for both nations?
Well, I think the threat that China poses, India has seen it in recent years more directly, I think, than any other country, with attacks along the line of actual control, threats to extend Chinese influence into Pakistan even more than it already is. Chinese efforts to map the floor of the Indian Ocean. They're not doing that to study the growths of coral. That's for strategic reasons. And these interests, I think, come together with others in the region, with Japan, with Australia, as you've mentioned already, in the Asian Security Quad. Nobody's looking for conflict here. Quite the contrary. I think these efforts to grow closer in security cooperation are to create structures that will deter Beijing from taking belligerent action. That's what we really want. This is to help ensure peace and stability.
Could you talk us through the foundational agreements which have actually taken us to this step? Had those agreements not been there, then we wouldn't be looking at high-end technology transfer. And those foundational agreements, which you've looked through very, very closely in your own work, define the strategic relationship between our countries.
Yeah, look, this has been in process for some time. I mean, for many years, I don't need to tell you or your listeners, people saw the relationship with India as half of the India-Pakistan issue. I think 20 years ago, during the George W. Bush administration, we broke that nexus, that we could have clear discussions with India on issues we have in common. And I think there's been a steady growth in cooperation. And I think today, the most significant evidence of that cooperation to date. But I think what this shows is that this is not mere theater, as sometimes happens in international affairs. This shows the growing connection between the two countries for reasons that have their own merits, certainly on the economic side, but are propelled by events in the world, not the events we've undertaken, but threats that we have seen from others. And I think this is a good basis on the bilateral side, absolutely. But I think it says to others, look, we can cooperate. You can join us in cooperation. We can increase all of our prosperity and increase our security too.
But Ambassador, we've got differences as well. Russia, India has a very close relationship. Is there an acceptance in the United States that that relationship between New Delhi and Moscow isn't going to go away? It can't.
Well, I don't think it can go away in the short term, but I think this is a hard decision that faces India because in addition to the U.S.-India Russia relationship, and we've got the biggest land war in Europe going on because of Russian aggression against Ukraine. The fact is that the Beijing-Moscow axis is growing day by day, and in this new Sino-Russian alliance, unlike in the Cold War, China is the dominant partner. It's not Russia, not the Soviet Union. It's China that's the dominant partner. And it's very hard to imagine that India would want to allow itself to continue to have a significant dependence on Russia for sophisticated military weapon systems when Russia is growing closer to what I think the main danger to India and the United States is, that is to say, China. So this is a complexity. I think the two leaders will certainly be talking about that because if you look for greater security cooperation, one thing we've learned over the years is that interoperability of weapon systems, compatibility, communications among them are critical to effective security. And when you have the Russians supplying both China and India, when China represents the main threat, that's a real problem to deal with.
And yet, Ambassador, the heart of the Indian military setup is essentially Russian at one level. More than 300 T-90 tanks, close to 270 Sukhoi 30 fighters. Even if there was a will to move away from Russian weaponry to perhaps better quality American weaponry or made in India weaponry, it realistically can't happen because it's simply unaffordable at the scale that India needs it, which is a practical reason why I would suggest that not even in the medium term would India and Russia move away from each other from a military relationship.
Well, I think it's going to take time. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think you're right. Obviously, time and money are closely related here, but it's looking at the long-term trajectory going forward. I don't think there's any reason why India's own capacity in the military space should not be expanding. That way, you won't have to be dependent on Russia. You're certainly welcome to buy American arms, but you could manufacture your own. There are companies in Europe that produce good weapon systems as well. I think it's the making a strategic decision that to deal with the main threat, which is where I think India's military sees it coming from China, you don't want to be dependent on somebody that may act at the direction of Beijing in time of a crisis. This is something new. Look, this has just been developing. We've seen Xi Jinping's recent visit to Moscow, which I think cemented the axis in place. And that's a change in strategy of tectonic proportions. So India's long-term reliance on Russia for strategic weapons, you can see the history, you can understand it, but history moves in a lot of different ways, and China's moves on Russia, I think, have presented a new strategic dilemma that can be solved by growing closer to the U.S., by increased capacity in India, and looking to other suppliers as well.
Ambassador, the other point of difference, of course, is India's import of oil from Russia. It's not that India doesn't have close relations with Ukraine, we obviously do, and it's not because we are oblivious to what the West has to say about the import of Russian oil. The fact of the matter is that India we have our own requirements. It's a huge economy, it's a huge population. Energy prices are expensive and we are getting a good deal over here. So in our national interest, the argument which is raised is that, look, we just have to go ahead and do this. America doesn't accept that argument. But isn't it, again, a pragmatic decision being taken by New Delhi?
Well, again, perhaps in the short term, but consider the longer term implications. What's at stake in Ukraine is an act of unprovoked aggression by Russia. This is something that we've certainly been imperfect in our concern about it over the years, but it's one reason we stood with Kuwait when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in another act of unprovoked aggression. It's why we stand with Ukraine. So I think India should be looking to find alternative sources of energy. Again, that doesn't happen overnight, but from the U.S., from the Middle East, much closer, much more secure than oil and gas supplies from Russia. I think that's something we should be looking at very carefully. And again, I hope the two leaders are talking about that.
A final question. President Biden just a little while back said that he intended to speak with Prime Minister Modi on an entire gamut of issues, which included the issue of human rights and democracy in a larger sense. Now, obviously, there are differences between India and the United States. It's become a prickly issue at some levels. But do you believe that both sides have the maturity to sort of deal with these differences without sort of talking down to each other?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think it's something that two friends can talk about and discuss. All I'd say is comparing the U.S. system, the India system, with the alternatives of China and Russia, we may have some issues between us, but we've got a lot more in common than we do with the other two countries.
All right, Ambassador Bolton, wonderful speaking to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. One of the other really important deals which has been signed this time around is an understanding that a leading American semiconductor company, and we're going to be telling you all about that, is going to be investing $825 million in India, and that's just a start. In as much as we talk about the strategic relationship, we do need to talk about the importance of the semiconductor deal. So as we get ready to talk to our panelists over here and my colleague Maha Siddiqui, let's bring you the details of why that semiconductor investment in India is so important. Phones, in our cars, in our laptops, in every sensor, in pretty much all modern electronic items, from the most basic workplace appliance to the most advanced ballistic missile submarines. We take semiconductors for granted, which we shouldn't, because they are extremely hard to get and harder still to manufacture, which is why India's tryst with world-class semiconductor manufacture has to begin now, at scale, for our future economic growth, and that's one key deal that the Prime Minister is looking at during this visit to the United States.
Back in the old days, computers were huge, made up of tubes and dials. They were fragile, they used huge amounts of electricity. Semiconductor chips replaced these tubes. Machines became smaller, more efficient, sleeker, way more powerful. The industries that rely most on semiconductors are computing, microprocessors and graphic processing units in your computer, for example, telecommunications, the 5G device on your phone and your phone's display, household appliances, the temperature control in your air conditioner, for example, banking, digital accounting, cloud platforms, security, the CCTV camera in your home, healthcare, pacemakers and monitors in hospitals and elsewhere, and transportation, engine control systems for cars, and the GPS maps that you use, also the manufacturing sector.
Now here is the problem for us in India. Our demand is huge and growing, but we lag in the semiconductor fabrication or FAB manufacture. We have a weak semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem. China had been a top exporter of semiconductors to India, which is problematic since a denial regime or a slowdown in such exports can be weaponized, which is why India wants to make semiconductors for India and the world right here in our country.
Statistics till 2021 showed that China was the top exporter of semiconductors to India, followed by Hong Kong and then Vietnam. To get over the dependence on China and a handful of East Asian nations, in December 2021, the government cleared a whopping $10 billion package to boost the semiconductor industry. India needs a host of superconductor chips of different types to make India a global hub for electronics manufacturing. That manufacturing at the moment is dominated by just a handful of companies around the world. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited, Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, and finally Micron.
In fact, it's Micron and another American company, Applied Materials, that the Prime Minister has invited to boost semiconductor manufacturing in India during his visit to the United States.
Micron is a global leader in memory and storage, and we are a supplier to for memory and storage in all end markets, from data centers to smartphones, to PCs, and today really fueling the AI engine as well. So we are excited about the opportunities that exist for the future of memory and storage. And again, congratulations to Prime Minister Modi on his excellent visit.
Micron's investment in India comes at a time when India's demand is projected to explode. According to the India Electronics and Semiconductor Association, the India market will touch $64 billion by 2026. That's 3 times the 2019 size of $22.7 billion. In addition to Micron, Vedanta and Foxconn have also signed an MOU with the Gujarat government to invest 1.5 lakh crore rupees to set up a semiconductor and display manufacturing plant in India. But the deal is yet to progress. India, it seems, is keen to step up ties with the US on semiconductors, signing an agreement to establish semiconductor supply chains under the framework of the Indo-US Commercial Dialogue. The future of manufacturing for India's digital economy depends closely on how this works out. Vishnu Shom for NDTV.
Well, joining us now, Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, Ambassador Meera Shankar and Michael Kugelman. I'd like to thank you all very much for being with us. Ambassador Akbaruddin, let's talk a little bit about semiconductors first. It's obviously important for our digital economy, particularly digital manufacturing in our economy, but it also perhaps needs to be looked at, would you agree, from a China standpoint. China has been the largest exporter of semiconductors to India. That's something that could be weaponized if they were to deny us supply. With India investing, with the US investing in India now, how is this a real opportunity for us from overcoming that dependence?
So Vishnu, you're right that we live in a world of geopolitics. That's the reality. Having said that, terminologies such as chip choking, friendshoring have become commonplace now.
True.
So if we are being provided opportunities for friendshoring, it's a good thing. The US says that it wants to build a small yard with high fences. So if the fences are opening, if we are part of the yard, it's good for us. Now, I take the point that there is a China impulse, but I think it's rather unfair to reduce India-US relations to a single point of focus. There are many more imperatives in our engagement with the US that are China agnostic. India needs technology, India needs investment, India needs skills. India has a diaspora connect with the USA. All these are China agnostic. By that I mean, whether there was China or not, we would still try and engage and gain a better relationship with the US. So yes, there is a China impulse, but it's a broader expanse, and we need to look at it in that, acknowledging that geopolitics will play a role, and it's a good opportunity for India to use the geopolitical situation to gain.
Ambassador Meera Shankar, what in your mind is the biggest takeaway from this visit?
Look, I think it's high in protocol, but also high promises to be high in substance. You have the GE-HAL deal for the F414 engine, and for the first time, the US is willing to set up a joint manufacturing facility in India and also to share technology. So that marks a significant advance on the nature of the defense cooperation that we have had with the US so far. As far as the semiconductor deal is concerned, and which you were talking about, I think India has an ecosystem which could actually be conducive to this, not in terms of manufacturing, but we are probably the biggest chip designer for different companies in the world. And we also promise to be a huge market for semiconductors in the future. So if you take a look at these two aspects, then the one missing link is the manufacturing capacity. And there, I think the first step is this Micron investment, which from what I see is looking at packaging or encasing and testing. So it's not the actual chip itself, but the final step. and but it's a first step. And then you have an agreement for training, I think, a very large number of engineers in semiconductors and other advanced technologies. So I think that, first steps are being taken. But looking beyond semiconductors, I would say this whole initiative for critical and emerging technologies, which promises to create or provides a framework for creating an ecosystem which brings together not just businesses in the two countries, but universities, research laboratories, academia, to work together in these frontier technologies of semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, telecommunications, and space. I think that holds great promise if we are able to make sure that there are concrete proposals which are developed under this framework. There's a lot of enthusiasm, but the challenge is going to be to concretize this because it's very, very promising for the future.
Right.
If you see the US, they are seeking to reorder, in a sense, the global economy. The heyday of free market trade is over, globalization is over, and they are looking to de-risk from China and to friendshoring. And I think a lot of that investment has gone to Vietnam or to Mexico. Not much has come to India, though a beginning has been made with this Apple and Foxconn investment in India. Now we need to accelerate that because India has the capacity, both the technical capacity, and it is going to be a huge market.
Ambassador, that's lots of important points. I just want to keep the ball rolling. I'll come back to you in a moment. Michael Kugelman, the other aspect of this, of course, is Prime Minister Modi speaking in the US Congress joint session for the second time. No Indian Prime Minister has done that. What does this signify?
Well, indeed, it's extremely unusual for a foreign leader to give two joint addresses to Congress during their term. It's quite remarkable. And I think a lot of people will be watching what Modi says on a number of issues, certainly Russia. We know that the U.S. and India do not necessarily see eye to eye on that matter. And I think that we can expect the Prime Minister perhaps to repeat what has become a mantra for him that's been received very well here in Washington on bipartisan levels, and that is that this is not an era of war. Now, if you look back at his last address to Congress in 2016, what struck me was how he was very careful to include a lot of references to popular culture in the U.S. Abraham Lincoln, baseball, things like that. And I think we'll see more of that for sure. But no, it's very significant, and I think that you're going to have a very strong turnout. Just about all elected, the current membership in Congress, a significant majority will be there. I know there have been some high-profile folks that have said that they're going to sit it out, but I think the fact that you're going to have such a strong showing from both Democrats and Republicans, that's concrete evidence of just how strong the multi-partisan support is for this relationship. And I know it's similar in India as well.
Ambassador Akbaruddin, despite this, there are concerns which have been expressed in the US administration, for example, on press freedoms in India, religious freedoms in India. Barack Obama, in an interview to CNN in just the last little while, has referred to his concerns and something that he said that he would have expressed to Prime Minister Modi if he met him. How would India look at these concerns? Should they be raised by President Biden? Because I believe they will be raised. That's what Mr. Biden said just as the two leaders were about to start speaking.
So Vishnu, any issue can be raised among two nations if there is a degree of trust and level of comfort. If the US and India are now in that state where they can exchange respectfully views on different issues, I'm certain it should not be a problem because it's not a one-sided dialogue. There are issues that India could raise too, not which are fundamental to the relationship, but which cause concern in India too. Hate crimes against Indians, how the US abandoned Afghanistan and we are now struggling to come to terms with it. F-16's refurbishment to Pakistan. These are all issues where we diverge. That's all right. We can respectfully raise our concerns. We have different historical experiences. They have different historical experiences. And I don't think we need to worry too much about it. We have a case to put forth. And should this be raised, I'm certain our leaders as well as our permanent civil servants will be able to explain our views forthrightly, candidly, and confidently.
Richard Rosso, Chair in the US-India Policy Studies Group at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, with us as well. Mr. Rosso, thanks very much for being with us. You know, we've been talking so much about the strategic aspect of this relationship, and I don't think I've spent enough time talking about the diaspora, talking about the needs of Indians in the United States. One of the biggest requirements was H-1B visa renewal. Now, it's something which seems to be common sense. Why would Indians need to travel back to India to get an H-1B visa renewal? Finally now, after years and years and years, America seems to accept that argument. So H-1B visa renewals might in fact take place in the United States alone. But it's steps like this which actually get to the core of what people in both countries need. Because at the end of the day, the relationship is between people, right?
It is. That's been fundamental. You know, we've had ups and downs on the commercial relationship, ups and downs on the strategic relationship, but people-to-people ties have been there throughout. A lot of Americans living in rural United States, the first person of Indian origin they might meet is a local doctor that came out through a visa program that brings medical professionals out for underserved communities in the United States. Technology workers, students at universities. And it sounds like today's joint statement in the summit is going to have a lot of emphasis and focus in terms of trying to unravel some of the tricky parts, expediting getting appointments in India, making sure that we've got more staff out there. It's a lot of good things teeing up, I think, in an area that has been the underpinning of the relationship, and I think we can do more in.
Mr. Rosso, in terms of another aspect of this deal that's important, and I'll ask Michael this question as well, the jet engine transfer deal, quite besides the strategic implications, I think it's a very strong business transaction because it helps establish an aerospace ecosystem in India that could easily translate into many thousands of jobs. Now that's important, and I'll tell you why, because Air India just signed that landmark deal which is going to result in thousands of jobs in America. And now you've got this deal which is going to translate into thousands of jobs in India, both aerospace. It's phenomenal. It's so interconnected in a sense.
Yeah, you know, the significance of the jet engine deal, there's another reason as well. I think a lot of folks that have been working on the India relationship for a long period of time in the U.S. government, they've thrown a lot of ideas at the wall in times past, and sometimes even ideas we thought were pretty self-obvious just couldn't stick. Jet engine, they came up as a working group when President Obama visited India during Republic Day in 2015. They had a working group established. They met. They just couldn't find any way to unlock a joint venture that would result in real credible technology transfer and the development of a new version of it. So it kind of gave up. We brought it up again, and 4 months later, it sounds like we're on the cusp of having an agreement announced. So I think for some American officials that feel that even the big ideas they put forward before India wouldn't respond to, things are happening faster than ever. And nothing is more proof of the fact that things are different, the ability to get big things done, than the jet engine deal. So jobs are great, transfer of technology is great, but it's a significant marker in showing things not possible just a decade ago move really fast now.
You know, Michael, there's another aspect of this relationship which is so interesting. It's the cooperation in space. It is very substantive because there's going to be an Indian in the International Space Station in 2024. That could be a low-hanging fruit in a sense. Our relationship has been very close. It was perhaps just a matter of time. But India signing on to the Artemis agreement, which is something which NASA has been speaking about the peaceful use of outer space, is again something which has China in mind, or Russia in mind as well, from an American standpoint. America wants India onto a brigade of countries which follows certain rules in space in as much as they do in, say, the Indo-Pacific region.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the Artemis Accords. I mean, we've talked about all the big ticket announcements we could expect to hear in the next few hours, but the Artemis Accords one is particularly significant because many, including myself, I should admit, didn't necessarily expect India to join or for that announcement to be made during this visit. Really significant, and I think it highlights just how multifaceted this relationship has become when you look at the list of the headline generating deals. You've got defense deals, you've got tech deals, the Micron announcement, and then of course you got the space thing with India joining the Artemis Accords. So absolutely, I'm not sure I'd use the term brigades to refer to the but I think that the general idea is indeed for the U.S. to be building coalitions of like-minded partners. And this I think goes back to one of the Biden administration's fundamental foreign policy goals from the day it took office, was to really strengthen U.S. leadership and restore alliances and partnerships that, in the Biden administration's view, had suffered during the Trump era. And there's been limited success with that in terms of gathering support to counter China, and certainly in terms of gathering support from countries to take a stronger stand against Russia. But I think that here we are seeing evidence that with India, so much success and progress being made in terms of how the two countries are starting to agree to partner on so many levels to counter this China challenge. And going back to the Micron deal, so important because we all know that one of there's a strategic element there. The goal is to better integrate India into diversifying global supply chains, particularly for critical and emerging technologies. And that Micron deal could really move the needle forward in a big way in that regard. So just, I think all good news all around in that regard.
All right, good news all around. It truly, this relationship has gone to the next level. Thank you all very much for being with us. We're going to keep tracking this particular state visit of the Indian Prime Minister to the United States, but that's after this short break. Welcome back. You're watching Left, Right and Centre. Throughout this week, we've been tracking this all-important state visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the United States. Today has been a day when so much has been looked at. About 5 to 6 important deals. The sixth one is the deal for drones. It's not yet been announced, but perhaps it will be sooner than later. Joining us now to discuss one very important aspect of the deal, the likelihood of an Indian being in space on the US space station, perhaps even next year. And then India as part of the Artemis process. That's something that the United States and NASA are championing. Two wonderful people and close friends, Dr. Amitabh Ghosh and Pallav Bagla. Amitabh, let me come to you first. Let's talk about Artemis, because I think a lot of people want to know about the space station, so we'll keep them hanging for a little while. Let's talk about Artemis, because it is so important for the future of our relationship in space.
Right. So, what is Artemis? So the last 20 years, you have been seeing the space station. So the space station has been the kind of platform to do experiments in space, right? Yeah. And so that is about to shift in the next 5 years. And that platform will change from, the space station is about 250 miles from Earth. This will become the moon. So the US is going back to the moon. It's the Artemis program. The first flight of the Space Launch System, or SLS, has already happened. The next will happen where astronauts will go around the moon and come back sometime next year. And then finally there'll be boots on the ground. So it's a huge deal. Like SpaceX is doing the lander, and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin is doing another lander, and there's the Space Launch System. So, you can think of the 1960s, the 70s of the Apollo program. So the moon is going to be the next frontier. Blue Origins is going to try to bring a base, set up a base there. This is going to be a huge project like the International Space Station. So you need international partners come together with a legal framework and in an engagement mechanism. What type of engagement? Why is it even necessary? So there has to be interoperability of various engineering systems so that they can work with each other. Then there has to be some sort of agreement of this is how you're going to, say, previous landing sites, resource utilization, usage of land on the moon. All these very important factors, there has to be some sort of an agreement. So what is the Artemis Accords? It is kind of before you get engaged in this huge project, you kind of are agreeing to the legal framework. That's why it's so very important. If you kind of don't see eye to eye, then it's tougher to come on board as a partner. So the fact that India is signing on is very good. But afterwards, what is the exact collaboration? That is still, unknown.
It's yet to be seen. Pallav, it's interesting that we likely have an India on the International Space Station because we are pursuing our space exploration dreams with two partners. Russia, which has been involved, for example, in the training of Indian astronauts whenever the Gaganyaan program actually happens. And now we will obviously be training with NASA as well. So keeping our options open, also our friendships alive.
Oh, certainly. See, if an Indian goes to the International Space Station on an American spaceship, I think it is going to help both countries. It is largely all about optics between the two countries and the friendship which is being shown. Remember, it was in 1963 when the first rocket which was launched from India was an American rocket. Relations soured in between, but then now relations are picking up again after 60 years. And in between, we also had the Chandrayaan-1 mission, which was a sterling collaboration between India and the US. India was the captain and others were partners. And now, if an Indian can go to the International Space Station, it'll be useful, but one will have to wait and watch as to what kind of science an Indian could do there. India already has its Gaganyaan program, which is to launch an Indian astronaut from Indian soil on an Indian rocket, and that is likely to happen in 2024 in a low Earth orbit. But to go to the International Space Station and also be part of the Artemis program, I think it's an interesting development, but we'll have to wait and watch and see what the nitty-gritty and the fine details are.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on this very important aspect of the relationship. Thank you very much indeed. What I'm going to do right now is go back to a little bit of the imagery, the pomp and the pageantry that we've actually seen outside the White House today, and to just apprise our viewers of what's going to happen next. So lots of celebrations outside the White House. The national anthems of both sides played. There was a military parade as well. This is all associated with a state visit. It is very rare. It's a rare honor. It's not happened too often. It's happened on a few occasions to Indian Prime Ministers in the past. But the first state visit accorded to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But this is the second time that Prime Minister Modi will be addressing the US Congress. When is that happening? It's happening in the early hours of the morning. We'll try and give you an update of the exact time. But I think what we will tell you or share with you is what comes up at about 10 p.m. tonight. That is when Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Joe Biden, after their bilateral talks, which is taking place now, will be addressing the media. Now, Prime Minister Modi doesn't address the media very much. However, on this occasion, he will be taking a couple of questions, perhaps just one question for Biden, one for Modi. But that should actually it's important because in a sense, there is an expectation that they would be able to summarize what aspects of the deal, of the deals that have been spoken about for the last couple of weeks have been looked at very seriously and are likely going through. But there will be a joint statement as well. Then, of course, later on in the early hours of the morning over here, but in the evening in the United States, towards the afternoon, in fact, in the United States, is when the Prime Minister will be going to the US Congress to make his address over there. So all very important developments. I would tell you that one of the important deals which has been signed or will be eventually signed between India and the United States is the deal for jet engine technology to be manufactured in India. It's important because, as we've explained, the jet engine technology is in fact the holy grail of aviation technology. Very few countries have it, and with India getting it, it really does open up an ecosystem in aerospace in India. Take a look.
Jet engine technology, widely considered the holy grail of civil and military aviation. This is the General Electric GE F414 engine. a cutting-edge jet engine that powers the F-A-18 Hornet, the US Navy's go-to fighter. This engine may now be produced by General Electric in India. In a multi-billion-dollar deal with Hindustan Aeronautics, with reports suggesting that America is willing to transfer key technology worth up to 80% of the value of the deal. It would power the LCA Mark II, an advanced variant of the Made in India Tejas fighter that you see here. The United States has never allowed the transfer of this level of technology to anyone. State-of-the-art jet engines include components which are deeply intellectual property rights protected, with manufacturing processes that are top secret. The technology that India may get includes coating and machining of single crystal turbine blades. What exactly are we talking about? Consider this. Manufacturing components of jet engine turbines has always been a massive engineering challenge through the history of aviation. Jet turbines need to retain their shape, their strength and their efficiency at temperatures up to 2000 degrees centigrade. Metal alloys used in older jet engines using conventional manufacturing techniques failed at the highest temperatures. They lost their thermal efficiency, which is why a handful of companies began to develop what they call single crystal turbine airfoils. Through profound chemical engineering of superalloys, single crystal turbine airfoils are able to achieve 3 times more engine life protection against corrosion resistance. Far lower overall weight. It's a lighter engine. A higher melting point temperature. This is absolutely critical. And massive engine life, much more than usual, up to 25,000 hours before an overhaul takes place. For India, the deal will mean that GE will open shop in India in partnership with HAL at a new plant to introduce the manufacturing processes required to build not just single crystal turbine blades, but also other key components, including laser drilling for combustion, machining of powder metallurgy, and the manufacture of compression discs and blades. The GE 414 IN6 engine, when it's built in India, will power not just India's indigenous Tejas Mark II fighter, but also the futuristic AMCA, or Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft, a stealth fighter. For the Indian Air Force, this will mean reliable and long-lasting jet engines. Russian engines in the past frequently needed an overhaul at a few hundred hours. Now you have engines which can be overhauled after several thousand hours. Engines which are lighter, more powerful, much more fuel efficient, and with the potential to be upgraded for future use. The benefits of all of this will be transformational for the Indian Armed Forces. Vishnu Shom for NDTV. All right, so in terms of what we expect for the remainder of this evening, 10 p.m. to 10:30 p.m., that's starting in about 10 minutes from now, if they stick to schedule, that's a little bit of an if. There'll be a joint press statement, and then they're expected to take a couple of questions. Then later on, 12:15 a.m., early hours of tomorrow, to 2:40 a.m., Prime Minister Modi's address to the joint sitting of the US Congress. And finally, 4 a.m. in the morning, but evening in the United States is when that state dinner at the White House will be taking place. So that's what's going to be happening over the next couple of hours. I can tell you that the Prime Minister will be having a meal rich in millets, and that's something that the US has looked at very, very closely indeed. So it's going to be quite interesting. Let's just try and see if we can get a few more details about what the Prime Minister will actually be eating. So I've actually got the menu. So bear with me as we go through this. Prime Minister Narendra Modi at dinner with the US President is going to be offered marinated millet and grilled corn kernel salad. Compressed watermelon and tangy avocado sauce would accompany that. There would be stuffed portobello mushrooms with a creamy saffron-infused risotto. Upon request, there is a non-veg option, which is a sumac roasted sea bass with lemon dill yogurt sauce and crisp millet cakes and summer squashes. It sounds delicious, absolutely. And finally, for dessert, rose and cardamom
infused strawberry shortcake. That's what the Prime Minister will be offered. But that's going to be many hours from now. But those important remarks, joint statement, that is expected. Let's see when it starts. That's coming up. Do stay tuned.